The cameras didn't catch everything. Grain, an angle, and the polite limits of surveillance turned most things into motion feet. A swinging door, a blur of fabric, but his eye picked up the shape beneath the desk. A hand tucked under the seam of a cardigan. The shoulder hunched like someone trying to fold themselves out of existence. Marcus Romano stood in the foyer of Sentinel Tower, coat still damp from the rain, and for a second the whole building narrowed to that single cramped movement. She was small against the reception desk, a young woman with hair tied in a loose knot and an ID badge that said Emma Pierce. When he stepped closer, she slid the hand away with a motion that tried to look accidental. The sleeve drooped to hide the bruise. Her voice was breathless, barely audible over the hum of the building's ventilation and the distant clack of heels. "Please don't tell anyone," she whispered. The words landed like a test. Marcus felt them as a challenge, as an invitation. He'd learned long ago that the things people begged you not to see were usually the things that needed the most seeing. He didn't answer immediately. He offered a smile that was measured, benignance neutoi, something professional and forgettable. He would be a blur to most of the building's regulars, another credential and another name. That was the point. "Morning," he said instead, voiced low enough not to startle her. He kept his eyes on the card reader and the way her fingers hovered over the phone. "Visitor for Hawthorne Interiors?" he added. "They said they'd check me in." She blinked, the motion small, controlled. "Sixth?" she said. Her voice betrayed a caution Marcus had seen before. The economy people learn to use when they live inside other people's judgment. "You hang on to that badge like it's a shield?" he said, casual. "Does it work?" For a heartbeat she considered not answering. Then, just a tightening around the mouth, she shook her head. "It's just a name." He watched her scan him workers, learn the language of looks. She catalogued his shoes, his badge, the way his hands rested. He could feel the quickened pulse under her collarbone, the tightness in her jaw. She tucked her arm under the desk again, as if she wanted to fold her elbow into nothing. Marcus reached into his bag for a pen, for the pretense of taking notes, and let his gaze drift to the receptionist's station, a mug with a logo from a law firm, a calendar with floral stickers next to the days she'd taken off, a phone face down on a strip of clear tape where someone had pressed it down to make it steady. The tape was new. Someone had been watching patterns here and making adjustments for her. He made a small joke about the rain and the elevator white noise, a way to let her know he wasn't a threat. She laughed a little, brittle. Her laugh didn't reach her eyes. When the elevator doors opened, he walked in behind another tenant and pretended to press the wrong floor. It gave him an excuse to stand inside with her for an extra beat. The doors closed and the car hummed to life. He could smell coffee and the faint chemical of floor polish. The woman in the corner scrolled through her phone. The maintenance man read a paper with one eyebrow raised. "Wrong floor," Marcus said. He smiled at her in a way that said he could be distracted, that he could be harmless. "Sorry. Habit." She offered him an odd, apologetic smile, like someone who felt guilty for looking tired. "It's okay." He noticed the way she inhaled when the car lurched to a stop, small, like a person trying to steady a minor fall. The sleeve of her blouse rode up, and a pale crescent of bruising showed over the forearm. Not new, but not old either. The kind that stipples when something has been clenched too hard or caught against a corner. It spoke of a hand, impatient and wrong, not a misstep. He made a mental note. Left forearm, threaded blue into yellow. Not a hospital-grade injury, maybe, but deliberate. A thing that could be explained away with a clumsy phrase and a shuffle of condolence. A thing that could be hidden. When he stepped out at the 6th floor, he half expected someone to follow him, security, watching without needing to be asked. No one did. The reception area below swallowed the rain and turned it into a hum. Emma's hand stayed tucked beneath her sweater, as if the bruise might reach out and demand notice if it showed its face. He made an appointment to return, for no reason other than to have reasons to be in the building. He told himself he was curious. He told himself curiosity was enough. If you want more stories like this, subscribe. There'll be more nights, more lobbies, more things people begged to keep secret. The next week he let himself become background. He took a table at the brass-roofed cafe on the corner opposite Sentinel Tower and watched the revolving door like a man reading a slow-motion film. Emma came out at 9 in the morning, coffee cup cradled, phone in her palm, small routines, rhythms. She walked with a cautious speed, steps that never fully belonged to the street. She checked the gutter, avoided eye contact with 3 different men. Once, she hesitated at the curb and looked back at the building as if it had been watching her all night. Marcus chronicled these motions with invisible marks. Shift change at 5, security rotations at 20 past. The janitor who always left his radio on the same station at midnight. He sketched the architecture of the building's people with a fast, clean hand. Everything that could be routine could be predicted. Predictability made corners where evidence could be found. He signed into the building under a false but plausible corporate name. Hoth Interiors was indeed a frequent client at Sentinel and let Dom Russo move when Dom always did. Like a chess player placing pieces out of sight. Dom, head of security, had the sort of ferocious loyalty that came with his own ledger of debts. He and Marcus had a shorthand that had nothing to do with ethics and everything to do with efficacy. Dom slid a manila folder across a table in the dim of a back room, his fingers stained with a day's worth of coffee and cigarette ash. "He's worse than rumors," Dom said. He laid out copies of settlement checks, copies of non-disclosure agreements, the same signatures repeated like a stamp. "You see this pattern, Marcus? Payoff here. Hush, payment there. There's a trail." Marcus looked at the numbers. They were small sums in isolation, but accumulated they formed a rhythm. Payroll adjustments that left holes. Vendor contracts that ended in unexplained credits. Shaw had the kind of arithmetic only visible if someone bothered to stack the papers and let the pages sing in sequence. "NDAs," Marcus said. The word tasted like a trap. "How many?" "Enough." Dom tapped the paper. "Enough that if you line them up and shake them a little, a face falls out." A face did fall out. Emma's name appeared not as a historic ledger entry, but as a shadow in the margins. Vacation days approved after incidents. A note that another employee had been encouraged to take leave, a settlement with someone who had worked maintenance. There were patterns in small outlays, petty reimbursements that smelled wrong. Marcus found a payroll line item that read Miscellaneous employee assistance with a check number that matched a deposit in an account controlled by someone with Shaw's initials. "You think he's paying her off?" Marcus asked. Dom's mouth went thin. "Maybe not directly. But people like to tidy things. They like their problems muffled." They watched security footage, frame by frame. The building's CCTV system offered grace in long stretches of static, but also revealed precise humiliations in small, undeniable frames. There was a clip of Shaw and Emma on the service corridor, 2 figures, caught by a lens, mounted high in a corner. They were too far away for voices, but the body language was plain. Him advancing, her stepping back. The desperate, quick motion that suggested a brusque contact. She stumbled slightly and clutched her arm. The camera frame gave no theater to the contact, only the fact of it. The footage was mercilessly clinical. Marcus paused the clip and watched the pixels where a bruise would bloom later. There was nothing explicit, nothing graphic, just the fact that someone had used his authority to correct a person who should not have needed correction. "What about her brother?" Dom asked, half to the empty room. "You said you'd check." Marcus had dug into Daniel Pierce before. The name turned up in court dockets, and in a neighborhood watch mailing list, and in a police arrest ledger's silvered history. Daniel was younger than Emma by a few years. The kind of kid who slid into wrong places because wrong places made him feel important and known for a hot minute. Marcus found an incident, a break-in, a misdemeanor, a plea deal that had left someone on a rope. Daniel's record was a map of vulnerability. "You sure there's a link?" Marcus asked. "It's never that tidy," Dom said. He tapped his thumb against a paper like someone testing the resonance. "But we're not looking for tidy, we're looking for a leva." Every time Marcus watched Emma in the lobby after that, he saw her shrink a little further into herself. She carried a file folder that never had the thickness of a full life. It was the kind of folder that contained only forms and small papers. A pen behind the ear, the same coffee cup, a sweater that might have been knitted to hide shapes. He sat with her at a bench in the lobby once when the rain gave way to a brittle sun. He asked her about the building, about her shift, About small banal things you ask to make people tell you true things by mistake. You ever get days where the elevator feels like a line? He asked, thinking of the way people take their breathing and make it private. She laughed at that. A small release. Every day, she said. Then she closed her mouth, as if deciding not to say more. Marcus held his silence like a room he'd left open for her to step into. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, thumb trembling. Marcus watched the micro-expression that came with a notification no one would voluntarily admit to being afraid of. She tucked the phone into her palm, closed her hand around it as if hiding it from someone. "Do you live around here?" he asked. "No," she said. "I have an apartment near 9th. It was a quick defense. People who needed to protect themselves learned to rehearse answers. There was a moment when he could have leaned in and said, "Look, I can see it. I can help, but..." The truth was not his 2Cs. He had worked long enough in the gray to know that aid given without consent is another form of violence. He wouldn't be the swaggering man who barged into a bad scene. That wasn't his style. He preferred to arrange the pieces so that the right people could see what needed to be seen. Outside, a man in a suit with neat shoulders looked at Emma and nodded, and then moved on. Marcus watched the nod with a slow, souring patience. To most of the building, she was a helpful greeter. To some, she was an instrument to manipulate. To Marcus, she was a person making the smallest possible choices to get through the day. He started to stitch the things he saw into a thread. The bruise, the nervous thumb over the phone, the pockets of incentive payments in the ledger, the old man who smiled at her and expected her to perform harmlessness. Patterns solidify under continued attention, and attention, he had decided, was a kind of muscle. He set up a small surveillance routine that was all legal and boring on the surface. Marcus showed up under a plausible corporate guise. Dom ran the cameras in the background to get better angles at the service corridors. Marcus booked brief consultations with maintenance staff under the pretense of checking lighting for a client. He made sure his presence could be explained if anyone asked. He always left his receipts. The footage they captured over the next 2 weeks did not advertise the abuses. It offered them in quiet, incremental tiles. In one clip, Shaw stood too close to a woman from accounts during an office party. She smiled in a way people smile to mollify men with rank. She eased away. In another, a maintenance worker accepted a small envelope from a vendor with Shaw's brand on it. There were times when hands met hands in ways cameras could not decode. Brief gestures, the way someone's mouth tightened. Nothing cinematic, just the steady accretion of small intimacies misused. Dom put a red folder in front of Marcus and tapped it. "Look at this one," he said. Inside were pay stub anomalies, invoices that led to accounts with opaque names, vendor credits to companies that didn't exist. The money moved in the kind of sick patterns Marcus had seen before. Small payments to keep mouths closed, mid-sized transfers to cover an urgent need, then a series of petty reimbursements to make the books look balanced. Shaw's signature appeared beside approvals for repairs that were never made. Marcus ran his finger along the edge of a spreadsheet and felt a cold satisfaction. This was the part he liked. The moment when mess turned into map. It was never glamorous. It was paperwork and patience and the slow terror of someone who thought they were invisible being made visible. Then there was Daniel. He was a blunt instrument, teenage Beluza stature, defensive and quick with his mouth. Marcus tracked him on social media, in court files, at a small bail house where Marcus had to exchange a look with a bartender and then pay a tab like a man buying anonymity. The kid's criminal record explained why Shaw's leverage worked. A brother with a record is a pocket of vulnerability someone with money and inclination will exploit. Marcus saw the way Shaw's payments could feed a cycle. Hush money here, pressure there. A threat whispered into a wallet that meant a jail cell might be waiting if certain expectations were not met. One night, in a cheap diner where fries came with the sort of salt that makes your mouth feel parched, Marcus finally spoke with Daniel. He found the kid on the edge of the counter, shoulders hunched around a coffee like he could drink his way into armor. "You, Pierce?" Marcus asked. Daniel blinked, suspicious. "Who wants to know?" "Someone who thinks you're tired of being pushed around." That made him laugh, sharp and bitter. "You don't know anything." "I know you have a record," Marcus said. He kept the statement neutral, not accusatory. I know that makes things complicated. The kid's jaw worked. There was an anger that smelled of necessity, of someone who had been given options and found only broken ones. He told Marcus slowly at first, then with the speed of confession, about being picked up once by the wrong crowd, about a friend who had asked for help and never paid him back, about the hole in his life where opportunities should have been. He said, without dramatic flourish, that sometimes he did things he wasn't proud of because choice had been a luxury he could not afford. And you paid for it, Marcus said. You paid because someone made you feel like your freedom was a thing on a scale. Daniel's eyes were wary. You want to tell my sister? You gonna tell her I? No, Marcus said, and meant it. Not unless you want me to. The kid folded in on himself. Shaw said, if I mess up, if I steal for him, he'll send me back. Back where? Back to jail. The word fell like a stone. He swallowed it whole. Or worse. He says he knows people. Daniel's voice would have sounded like an accusation if it hadn't carried the fragile tone of someone trying to survive a long night. Marcus watched him and thought about leverage. He thought about the way power works. First, you find the weak places in a person's life, and then you bring pressure where it hurts. A brother's silence could be purchased in a single envelope. A job could be threatened with a whisper. An injury could be turned into a currency of shame. He had options, too. Marcus had lived a life that allowed him access to methods that were not always pretty. He had hands in places that could move people or money, but he also had to consider the consequences of his own taste for control. He had not come to Sentinel Tower as an avenging angel. He had come because someone had asked him, with a look and a bruise and a whisper, to notice. He started to build a plan, not a violent one, not a revenge fantasy, but a methodical, strategic dismantling. Evidence, he thought, would be the safest route. Paper that could be shown in a courtroom, tapes that could not be dismissed as rumor, witnesses who could corroborate stories, law enforcement that could not be bought with small cash envelopes. He wanted a takedown that would not feed the very machine of fear that had made Emma tuck her arm into herself. There was still a risk. If Shaw suspected he was being watched, he could tighten the leash on Daniel or shift his attention to someone else. He could make threats that were more vivid than paperwork. Marcus had to balance speed with cover. He had to make sure Emma consented before he used anything that might expose her to further danger. Consent was not a box to be checked. It was the axis of everything he planned to do. Then he found a ledger. It was an old vendor book, mixing legitimate invoices with hand-scrawled notes, a messy hybrid of business and extortion. Marcus discovered it slipped between a box of maintenance records in a storage closet Dom had access to. The handwriting was hurried, with initials and shorthand. DP. One line read, followed by a number, and then a dated check number. Another line referenced lobby incident with a note that looked like an account code. He ran the numbers and fed them into Dom's spreadsheet and watched as disparate sums aligned into a pattern. The money didn't disappear. It just moved sideways. It moved to accounts that paid for quick things. A cash withdrawal here, a small fund there, a donation that later came back as a vendor credit. Shaw's handwriting appeared across 3 separate sheets in near-identical loops. This was tangible. This was the kind of file a prosecutor could follow. He printed out a copy and held it for a long time, the pages whispering in his hands like a small wind. The edges ticked at his fingers. He could already see the headlines if he let his imagination run. Shaw arrested. Sentinel Tower rearranged, but he kept himself tethered to the facts, to the ledger, to the clip of video where Emma's arm had been clutched by someone with the kind of entitlement that came from owning a building and thinking it made them a god. He thought of Emma's whispered plea, "Please, don't tell anyone." He thought about how that plea had the sound of someone who had been taught invisibility as a survival skill. He thought about Daniel and the economy of fear that kept him small. Marcus knew he had to bring this to law enforcement, but he also knew you couldn't hand off a mess half. Prosecutors were beasts of burden. They needed rope to hold accusations. Evidence, documented and traced, was the only way a person like Shaw could be stripped of the facade his money purchased. He didn't want to be the man who barged in and broke things. He wanted to be the man who made the system do its job. He had a reputation for favoring spectacle when necessary, but spectacle was messy. He had learned that legal collapse was quieter and harder to rebuild from. It left a man stripped of his networks and his ability to buy silence. There were other considerations. Emma's privacy, whether she would want her story made public, whether she feared reprisal beyond the building, was Shaw connected to people who could reach beyond Sentinel Tower. Marcus was meticulous because recklessness snowballed. He started to collect timestamps from the CCTV, copies of payroll adjustments, invoices for maintenance that never happened. Dom helped with access and with blocking surveillance of their own movements. Marcus used legitimate pretexts to subpoena records where necessary, visiting clerks and making small purchases to keep his cover simple. He used his background as leverage to open doors that would otherwise require a warrant. He was careful to document every step in a way that could be presented later. Emma remained the wild variable. Marcus needed her trust to move forward ethically. He had no right to make decisions that would change her life without her input. He wasn't a hero in his inner monologue. He was a man with resources and a conscience that sometimes left him sleepless. Late one night, he found her at the small laundromat on 9th. She washed and folded in silence, the fluorescent lights making the room feel like a cheap confessional. He sat a few machines down and watched the rhythm of her hands. When she noticed him, she pretended not to. "You work late?" he said. A line. A gentle intrusion. She looked at him across the hum of machines, her face lit from beneath by the drumlight. "Yeah." The answer was a stone tossed into a pond, sending small ripples. "Night shifts. You ever think about quitting?" he asked, blunt. She looked at him in a way that weighed the question as if it were a lever. "Who would take care of my brother?" she asked. It landed harder than any piece of evidence. Marcus had catalogued Daniel's record. He had felt, in the kid's outline, the potential for leverage and the hunger that came with scarcity. He had not expected to find it echoing so clearly in Emma's choices. "She's staying because she thinks it's better than nothing," Marcus thought later. When the laundromat lights had burned out and he drove down empty streets, he could see the shape of her life in the folded towels, careful, practical, a system of small economies. People like Emma made decisions by trade-offs. Attend night classes or pick up extra shifts, call the police and risk unemployment, keep quiet and preserve the battered semblance of security. He made a list, not a plan so much as a ledger of obligations. Find more footage, identify financial trails, corroborate witness statements, and, perhaps the most delicate item of all, bring Emma into the loop when he had more than gossip to offer. He also thought, with something like shame, and with something like resolve, about the choices he'd made in his life that had led him to this. Marcus Romano had not always been a man who looked for lawful remedies. His past included favors paid in ways no prosecutor would bless. He had friends who still valued speed over process, but Sentinel Tower was not an arena for that old grace. This was a woman's life, and he had no right to make it collateral for his own sense of justice. A week later, Emma stepped out of the building and nearly collided with a delivery man. Her arm brushed the van's metal and she flinched hard enough to fold over on herself. A small crowd glanced but kept moving. People are practiced at deflection. Marcus saw the tiny wince and the way she curled the injured arm to the center of herself like a sacred object she was ashamed to display. He followed at a distance as she crossed the street and ducked into a cafe. The rain had come back, blotting the city in a gray wash. The cafe smelled of espresso and lemon oil. He took the stool opposite her and ordered something he didn't like. She stared into her cup as though it contained another life. "You shouldn't be out in this," he said. Her laugh was dry. "I don't have much choice." "You don't have to keep making those choices if they're killing you," he said. She looked up then, eyes raw and guarded. For the first time since he met her, there was a crack. "You don't even know me," she said. People like me are the ones who notice when people like you hide," he finished. He didn't mean to be flippant. He just needed her to hear that someone who could help existed without making her feel indebted. There was something solemn in the way she listened. Marcus laid out, in plain language, what he had: footage fragments, financial anomalies, A ledger that suggested someone with authority was directing money in odd directions. He presented the facts like a surgeon offering options. No flourish, no theatrical indignation, just a map. Emma folded her hands so tightly, the knuckles whitened. I can't go back, she said finally. If they know. Her voice frayed. She looked smaller than she had at the reception desk, like a cardboard cutout in a large office. You don't have to, Marcus said. But you have to decide what you want to be done, and you have to decide what you'll allow us to use. It was the first time she'd named the ledger of consent he'd been circling. He told her about Daniel and the pressures that came with records and threats and money. He told her about the ledger he'd found. He told her how law enforcement needed a trail they could follow and how he could help provide one in a way that wouldn't humiliate her in public. She listened, and when she finally spoke, it was cautiously, like someone testing the weight of a new object in her palm. If you do this, if you go through with it, she paused and breathed out. I have to know that Daniel's safe. I have to know my income is protected. I have to make sure they can't come after me. That's what we'll do, Marcus said. We'll make sure there's a plan in place. You'll have paid leave. You'll have medical care. We'll make sure your brother is covered. She looked at him then, with an expression that teetered between distrust and the faintest odd hope. How can I trust you? He met her look honestly. You don't have to, not now. You have to trust that I'll listen when you say no, and if you say yes, you get to choose the terms. No one gets to speak for you. The honesty in his voice was a thing he cultivated like a small plant. It was not a grand redemption. It was a tactic rooted in an understanding that he'd been too often used as an instrument. He wanted to be different in this. She exhaled, and the motion seemed to take a year off her shoulders. There was a woman used to work on the 15th, she said in a low voice. Sarah? She left last year, said she was moving out of town. I heard the sentence failed her. Marcus Casisha was palming a memory of something else that had been hushed. He pressed, gently. Sarah Chun? Yes! Emma looked like she had swallowed something bitter. I tried to talk to her once. She said, go to HR. She laughed. She said HR was a phone number you called to have your fear explained. Marcus made a mental note to find Sarah. People like Sarathos, who had left, were often the missing puzzle pieces. They were the ones who had survived enough to know the pattern and had chosen, for reasons of their own, to step away. They would be harsh and honest and valuable. He left the cafe, with an outline, in his head. He had consent in a way that counted. Emma had agreed to hear the plan and had set conditions. Marcus respected those conditions, like laws. He was not the sort of man who would violate a person's trust in pursuit of his own righteousness. He had broken rules before. This was not an occasion for him to do that. The files accumulated. Each piece of paper sat like a small decision. A timestamp here, a ledger page there, a printed frame of the clip where Emma stumbled. Marcus and Dom cross-referenced line items until the ledger's handwriting could be traced to a set of payments that had an account opening at a small local credit union, with a name tied obliquely to a maintenance contractor. It was the kind of corporate cloak that worked in plain sight. An LLC that existed for the sole purpose of moving petty extortion money and disguising it as repairs. He called an old friend, a contact who had become an attorney doing whistleblower cases for a fee, and asked for advice on presenting the materials in a way that would make a prosecutor's job easier. The friend emphasized what Marcus already knew: chain of custody and corroborating witnesses. You hand them a rumor and it's garbage, she said. You hand them a paper trail, plus a witness who will swear it's not a mistake, and you have something. Marcus thought about witnesses. He thought about Sarah, about maintenance workers who had been asked to sign false invoices, about a vendor who had recorded a payment and later scratched it out. Each person who would corroborate would be a risk, but risk was the fabric of truth. He gathered every plausible corroboration he could. The maintenance logs, the timesheets keyed to the moment of the bruise, payroll entries, a vendor check with a signature that matched a known handwriting sample. He made copies and copies and stored them in places he could justify. He balanced paranoia with prudence. There was a moment when he realized he had crossed a line from observation to guardianship. He had taken responsibility without asking for permission beyond consent to share. That was the dangerous part of being a man who could act. You quickly become the architect of someone else's fate. He rubbed his thumb over the edges of the last printed ledger and thought of Emma folding towels in a laundromat. He thought of a whisper that had been not a plea but a contract with someone else's fear. He thought about what it meant to unmask a harm without making the person harmed feel exposed. The case had teeth now. It had a jaw that could bite, but the jaw required a hand to operate it. Law enforcement would have to be that hand. He wanted to hand over a case unassailable, but he also needed to ensure Emma's life didn't fracture in the waiting. He made the decision to bring the materials to a local prosecutor who had a reputation for taking corporate wrongdoings seriously. The name came easy. A woman who'd been a DA in a neighboring county, now working in the state attorney's office. She liked the clean logic of financial crimes and had a temper for men who thought money put them above law. Marcus arranged a meeting for the following Tuesday. He told Dom to keep a shadow on Sentinel Tower the same week and to lock any maintenance closets that might have been used as drop spots. He told Dom to check in with the vendor houses and quietly ask for their ledgers under the guise of routine compliance checks. He told Emma, carefully, that he was going to speak to someone who could pursue these things professionally. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She handed him a small scrap of paper with Daniel's last known address and a phone number for a friend. If you do anything, she said, her voice fragile, keep him safe. Marcus read the number and folded the paper into his pocket like a charge. He thought of all the ways choices ripple and how a decision made in a small cafe could end up changing the course of a life. On Monday, he found a disk drive in a janitor's closet that had been left in a box labeled old footage. The building had been renovated once and cameras replaced. Old hard drives were supposed to be archived. Someone had stuffed this drive and moved on. Marcus pried it out like a man extracting a tooth. He hooked it to his laptop in the back room of a print shop and watched as files populated the screen. That it was. A raw clip from a camera angle that rarely recorded. A loop that showed a brief exchange in the service corridor. In the clip, Emma's arm jutted and then bent, a hand indecently grabbing, then releasing with enough force to throw her balance. The frame did not show the full assault he suspected. It showed an action and the aftermath. The bruise on her forearm was visible in the next frames as she clutched it, the way a person holds a fresh argument with their body. He held the file like a relic and understood, in a small, righteous way, how a life could be unpicked by a single frame when shown in the right room. He did not rush to celebrate. He called his attorney friend and sent her the packet-careful notes, times, the ledger scans, the clip. She answered quickly and with a professional coldness that made Marcus trust her more. You've got something, she said, but it's raw and it's dangerous. We need to make the chain of custody tight and pick the right partners in law enforcement. If Shaw smelled us, he'll do exactly what you fear. Marcus sat back and let the couch of consequence receive him. He had what he needed to start. He had consent in the form of Emma's guarded agreement to seek help, a ledger that traced money, a witness who had been bought off, and a brother who sat on a rope. He thought of the whisper again. Please, don't tell anyone. He wanted to tell her, quietly, that she had not asked the wrong man to notice her. He wanted to make sure that the way he would act would not turn his notice into a spectacle she would regret. On Tuesday morning, he walked into the state attorney's office with a folder exactly as thick as truth required. He handed the material to a woman who read with a mouth that pursed and then opened like a trap for liars. She took the files and arranged them with a professional surgeon's economy. There was a small exchange that felt like admitting a case into a hospital. Someone would take it, someone would keep it alive. Later that day, he found Emma at the desk. She was one of those people who moved through the day as if the lights might go out and she would be left mid. He told her, simply, that he had spoken to someone. He did not read her reaction like a victory. Are you sure? She asked. No, he said. Honestly, I'm sure we're taking a step that could, if everything goes right, make changes. She closed her eyes for a breath. A human thing, surrender or acceptance. He could not tell which. "I'm only asking that my brother is safe," she said. "And that I don't lose my job." "We'll fight for both," he said. What he didn't tell her, what he could not yet speak aloud, was the tightness at his own lung. There was a man in that tower who thought he could buy quiet. Marcus had found coins of hush in the ledger, and fingerprints of intention in the footage. But power learned to hide. The rich have ways of turning grace into armor. That evening, Marcus sat in his car at the edge of a parking lot and watched the building through rain-streaked glass. In his hand he balanced a printed page with an account number tagged to a contractor's signature. It was enough to begin making noise that would not be easily muffled. It was also enough to mark him as someone who had upset a dangerous equilibrium. He dialed Dom. "Start lining up the witnesses," he said evenly. "Call Sarah Chun. Get the vendor files. And Dom, be careful. If anyone from Shaw's circle gets nervous, pull the cameras that can't be traced. Make the trail clean." Dom moved like someone who had learned to be invisible while making a room function. He slipped through Sentinel Towers, back corridors with a list in his head, and small bribes of courtesy. A coffee for a clerk. A favor called in to a vendor who owed him a debt. He needed names and signatures, people who remembered the odd envelope or the awkward conversation at 3 in the morning. He needed people who had been asked to sign things without trusting them, or who had been told to reroute invoices to companies that smelled like fiction. Sarah Chun answered her phone on the second ring. Her voice was cautious, then colder, when Dom explained who he was. She had left Sentinel a year earlier, worked briefly for a non-profit, and had kept distance from the accounts of that building like someone who had learned to avoid mirrors. "I don't want attention," she said at first. Then, after a pause, "But I won't lie for him." Her corroboration was granular. She remembered the way Shaw would call certain staff into his office and ask them to tidy up payroll with a laugh that wasn't a joke. She remembered a night she'd been encouraged to take a weekend Dan offer that had been placed into her hands as if it were a favor. She gave dates, names, phrases. Marcus listened and transcribed, letting her voice lend weight to paper that had been waiting for context. They pulled vendor ledgers and found more names. A maintenance LLC that existed on paper, a landscaping company that never visited the tower, invoices for glasswork on floors that still gleamed untouched. The money moved like a tide that never touched sand. It washed through accounts and left fingerprints in the margins. Marcus and Dom sewed the margins together with dates and signatures until the picture read like testimony. Marcus took the files to the prosecutor with the kind of quiet he saved for things that had dignity. The state attorney's office brought in a federal agent who specialized in white-collar investigations. The agent moved like someone who liked steps and records. Subpoenas issued one after another. Servers copied, a team assigned to the case. Chain of custody was the liturgy they recited, signed, dated, sealed, because a story without the priesthood of procedure could be dismissed as rumor. They also set a protection plan. The labor board issued emergency notices to Sentinel Tower, and the company's insurance lawyer quietly opened a file. Emma would not be left in the old patterns of exchange. Her income would be secured with a temporary administrative leave on full pay, her position held, medical expenses immediately authorized. The first acts of justice were practical ones: bandages and bank transfers. Daniel's phone was harder to find. Marcus made a call to an outreach program that worked with young men caught in cycles of petty crimes and offered Daniel a chance to enroll in a diversion program, counseling, job training, supervised community service. It was not a pardon. It was a path out of a place where mistakes calcify into identity. Daniel agreed to a meeting in a community center with a social worker from the program. He was suspicious and raw, but when Marcus told him here was a plan that might keep him out of a cell and give him a paycheck, the skepticism thinned a little. "You still looking out for my sister?" Daniel asked in a voice that tried not to sound broken. "Always," Marcus said. He meant it in a way that did not redeem his past. It simply marked his choice, now. There were moments of danger. A car followed Dom across 3 boroughs. Cameras on a courier van recorded an unfamiliar man loitering under Sentinel's awning late at night. Shaw, when he realized the ledger gap in the subpoenas, floated rumors through the building like a man trying to poison a well. He spoke to HR with the practiced arrogance of somebody who'd never been denied his narrative. he planted doubts. He called maintenance and asked for a list of who had keys to the closets. He met with vendors and asked if anyone had been approached by a man posing as a consultant. The net tightened, but the net was controlled now by law, not by intimidation. The federal agent coordinated a discreet meeting with the state attorney and a labor investigator. They agreed on a date for executing search warrants, a morning when Shaw would be in his office, signing checks and feeling the old comfort of a man who believed his pattern unassailable. Emma sat with a counselor the day before the operation and read through options on a small legal sheet. Marcus did not attend. He let her choose whether to be notified the moment action opened or to stay away from spectacle. She chose to be informed but not present to avoid the theater of arrest. Marcus respected that. He had wanted to spare her the exposure of being the public face of her own harm. "Do you want me there?" he asked her later, voice low in the small kitchen of the apartment she shared with her brother's old records. The fluorescent light made everything look more honest. "No," she said, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I want this over. I want to stop hiding my arm." Her answer was not the silence of helplessness, it was a decision. She had agency and conditions. She wanted Daniel out of reach before anything that might make him a target. She wanted her name not to be dragged across a tabloid. She wanted restitution for what had been done. They took precautions. Daniel was moved by the social worker to a relative's flat out of state for a week under a temporary protection order. The labor board placed a hold on Sentinel Tower's petty cash accounts. The prosecutor arranged for a neutral clinic to examine Emma and document injuries with a medical affidavit that would travel into evidence without making her a spectacle. Marcus watched the process and felt the odd tug of not being needed in the raw ways he had been. Help could be organized by people who wore badges and lodged cases with court dockets. That was an architecture he appreciated. The morning the warrants were executed, Sentinel Tower smelled like ordinary paperwork and coffee. Shaw arrived in a pressed shirt and the kind of tie that suggested a man with small rituals. He paced his office, sipping a black coffee that made his hands smoke. The agents moved like a silent list. They wore suits and carried paperwork that could authorize the undoing of a life. They had warrants for files, for servers, for bank accounts that had questions to answer. Shaw's face went through a slow range of expressions: irritation, disbelief, the first small peak of anger, then the carefully manufactured outrage of a man who thought reputation was a shield. The agents read the charges aloud: Embezzlemento caution blackmail assaulto. For a second, he tried to laugh. The laugh was thin. "On whose authority?" he demanded, voice sharpened for an audience. "State and federal," said the agent, who had taken an interest in the ledger months earlier. "You have the right to counsel." Shaw's hands shook when they cuffed him. It was not the shaking of a man who had faced consequence before. It was the shaking of someone who had believed himself too wealthy to be accountable. He was led out through the lobby past the very desk where Emma had stood so many mornings, and the building exhaled in a way nobody in the lobby could trace. Some people watched from the elevators with detached curiosity. A few staff followed at a respectful distance, eyes red as if they had been waiting to be right. The legal work that followed was grueling and never theatrical. Depositions, motions, criminal complaints. The ledger and the clip were laid out and linked by witness testimony. Sarah's account. A maintenance supervisor who admitted to tampering with invoices on request. A vendor who testified that payments were requested to be routed through an LLC. Each testimony was a nail in a structure that had for so long been propped up with small crimes and the currency of fear. Emma signed for every decision. She approved the use of the clip. She agreed to have Sarah's testimony referenced in the case. She did not, as she feared she might, collapse under the weight of telling her own story. She mediated it with the steadiness of someone who had been practicing small acts of survival that now translated into public reckoning. Daniel's cooperation became a turning point in the prosecution's case. He testified how he'd been pressured into small thefts, how an envelope had been slipped to him as a shield, how the implication of returning to jail was used as a lever. His testimony was not redemptive in itself. He acknowledged his mistakes, but it did provide the narrative thread prosecutors needed to show intent and pattern. As part of a plea agreement that recognized his youth and his cooperation, Daniel agreed to community service, to enroll in the vocational program, and to submit to supervised release for a period. It was a bargain that held him accountable without becoming a life sentence. When the indictment came down, it hit Shaw not just with criminal charges, but with civil suits from employees who had been encouraged to sign away injuries. The building's board replaced him, citing internal reviews and citing a desire to rebuild trust. The press wrote about the lawsuits. Shaw's name fell from the kind of lists that used to elevate him. A man once comfortable in the currency of silent favors now found his phone strangely useless. There were no triumphant speeches. Real consequences are dull and slow, administered not in a single dramatic moment but in a sequence of paper and hearing rooms that trim away pretense. Marcus watched all of it with the cool patience of a man who had learned to enjoy the problem-solving more than the applause. He had desired justice, not vengeance. He had wanted to strip the powers that allowed abuse and expose them to law. Emma's recovery was neither quick nor theatrical. She took a series of small, stubborn steps. The medical clinic cleared physical damage with a doctor who spoke plainly about healing and therapy. She took a leave of absence and attended counseling sessions twice a week. The counselor taught her mechanisms for dealing with startle responses, with nights where sleep felt like a thin sheet. Marcus never told her to hurry. Instead, he arranged for practical things. Bills paid for a time. A small stipend to cover books so she could start classes again. A tutor to help her apply for a night program in office management. "You should be in charge," Dom said once, blunt, in the way that sounded like affection. Dom had watched people who hid beneath desks for a long time. He respected those who straightened their shoulders. "You should be the one hiring the next guy like Shaw." Emma laughed at the thought and then, when the laugh left her, she said, "I don't know how." "Then you'll learn," Dom said. "You'll learn how they sign checks and how they try to keep people small. Then you'll make sure someone can't do it again." People offered help in clumsy and earnest ways. A small coalition of tenants from Sentinel Tower, embarrassed, some ashamed, some practical donate to a fund to cover Daniel's program and to make sure Emma could take time away without debt piling like stones. The insurance company covered counseling. The labor board opened a hotline for workers in the building and others across the city. The tiny systemic change felt modest and luminous because of how much had been denied for so long. Marcus had a different kind of idea. One born of the belief that power, when redirected, could be a guardrail. He spoke to Emma about it tentatively one evening in the small community room of the nonprofit where Sarah now worked. He wanted to create a small foundation and organization that would provide immediate aid to workers in precarious positions, emergency funds, legal support, counseling, and a rapid response team to preserve evidence. "If it's my name on anything, I don't want it to look like a favor," Marcus said. "I want it to be institutional. I want it to survive me." Emma considered. She had learned to be protective of her autonomy and wary of men who wanted to take credit. "No one should profit off this," she said. "No one should make it into a story about their redemption." He heard the warning and set his own pride aside. The initiative would be independent, she insisted, governed by survivors and advocates. Marcus provided seed funding money from sources he wouldn't discuss, rooted through legitimate channels and legally vetted. That mattered less than the way Emma insisted on governance that would protect its mission from charisma and from the risk of being co-opted. They called it the Invisible Initiative, a name Emma chose to reflect the work, to make visible what systems had rendered unseen. It offered immediate grants to cover missed paychecks, legal coordination for workers facing retaliation, and training for HR personnel on how to handle allegations without making victims collateral. It pushed for mandatory reporting policies in buildings across the city and supported a bill in the state legislature that would increase penalties for workplace coercion involving financial manipulation. The initiative began small: an office in a converted storefront, a part-time social worker, a hotline. Volunteers came from odd places, former HR managers who'd grown tired of their industry's apathy, a few lawyers who took pro bono hours, and Sarah, who had found purpose in turning her story into something that helped others. Emma led outreach, listening to people who called in rough. At first she was terrified of being known as the person whose arm had been hidden, but slowly the narrative shifted. She was a leader who had once been invisible, and now used her experience to design safer corners for others. The work was quiet and often bureaucratic. They helped a temp who had been forced to work unpaid overtime with a small grant to cover missed wages. They petitioned a landlord who had been complicit in a chain of hush payments. They advised a worker on how to document injuries without fear. Each small victory felt sacred because it created a precedent. 5 years later, the Invisible Initiative hosted a modest launch at a community college auditorium. The room filled with people who had once been afraid to speak, and with those who had listened. There were speeches, but not the kind that sought to claim heroism. Emma stood at the podium and spoke with a voice that had been tempered by pain and shaped by practice. She thanked those who had helped and made a point to name what the initiative would not be: a vehicle for any one person's absolution. "I used to hide my arm," she told the audience. "I used to hope people would look away. I learned that being seen is not a punishment. It's the first step toward being helped." There were nods. A man in the front row wiped his eyes. Marcus stood near the back. Not in the photos, not in the press releases. He watched the room like a man who preferred to be useful in silence. He did not seek applause. He had, in his earlier life, kept himself alive with the illusion of control. Now he measured himself by the number of people who felt safer because of the work arranged by others. Shaw's trial had been long. He was convicted on multiple counts: embezzlement, coercion, and a criminal count for the pattern of payoffs that enabled him to run a web of silence. He was sentenced to time that matched the harm of his white-collar armor. Restitution was ordered. Civil suits forced a reconfiguration of Sentinel Tower's practices: mandatory disclosure of payments, third-party audits, and a whistleblower protection clause that made it harder for managers to hide behind NDA. The city legislature amended labor codes to make it easier to prosecute financial coercion in the workplace. A small change that took years to pass, but that now stood as an institutional barrier against the quiet economy of hush money. For Emma, the passage of time did not erase the memory of pain, but it shifted the context in which she processed it. She took a course in organizational psychology, then one in nonprofit leadership. She accepted a job offer to head the Invisible Initiative full-time. It was both terrifying and clarifying. She would no longer be simply responding to harm. She would be designing systems to prevent it. Daniel found a steady job at a warehouse training program, coordinated through the initiative's partners. He kept to himself at first, then began to laugh more in the apartment they shared on slow Saturdays. He enrolled in evening classes and made a friend who taught him how to fix a sink. He didn't leave his past unexamined. He worked through it in counseling, learning that accountability and growth were not mutually exclusive. Emma and Marcus did not have the neatness of a cinematic reconciliation. He remained a man who chose to step back. She sometimes wondered about the source of the money that had helped her get through the earliest weeks. Marcus told her, once, that he had simply redirected influence to repair a harm. She accepted the answer enough to make peace with the shape of their alliance. "That's how power works," she said to him one winter night as they closed the office together. "People use it to hide. I want us to use it to protect." He nodded. "Then we keep building walls around who can't build them themselves." Their work expanded in modest increments. Workshops for HR professionals, legal clinics hosted at neighborhood libraries, an emergency fund that became a lifeline for temp workers and gig workers who found themselves coerced by men who mistook economic vulnerability for leverage. There were setbacks. Not every case fit the neat templates they hoped. Some employers fought back with lawyers who knew how to wring procedure into exhaustion. Some survivors decided not to move forward. The initiative learned to respect those choices and to pivot. Resources for self-care, for privacy, for legal counseling that honored confidentiality. The loud victories were fewer than the quiet ones, but the net effect gathered like sediment. It changed the riverbed. At the gala 5 years after the first dossier was filed, Emma addressed donors and policymakers. She spoke about the work ahead and about the ordinary economies that keep people small. She told one story that cut through the rooms of plates and polite applause. The story of a receptionist who tucked her arm away and asked, in a whisper, to be left unseen. People in the crowd who had never thought about the ethics of the lobby heard in that line a moral they had avoided for convenience. Marcus did not go to the microphone. He walked through the room quietly, greeting a few people, then slipped out into the night. He preferred the street to the stage, the act to the accolade. He had been part of the orchestration of a legal takedown that relied on institutions he now trusted more than his earlier methods. That was the change he hoped mattered. Years later, still, Emma stood in a classroom teaching a group of new HR trainees about the difference between protecting a brand and protecting people. She spoke about the ledger and showed a sanitized version of the pattern, how small payments create obedience, how NDAs can be used as instruments of control. She talked about how surveillance can reveal small crimes and how evidence is not a quick fix, but a tool. After class, a young woman approached her and said her supervisor had been asking for off-the-books adjustments to payroll. The woman was frightened and angry and grateful. Emma listened, and then she called a colleague at the initiative while the young woman sat with a cup of cheap coffee and felt, for the first time in a long while, like someone might act on her behalf. At the end of the arc, it was not about the single man who had been arrested. It was about the shift from silence to systems. Sentinel Tower was a different place. HR protocols had been rewritten. The tenant association held quarterly reviews. The company that managed the building had instated outside audits. The change was structural, not miraculous. It took laws and people and time. Marcus kept his distance from the public story. When reporters dug for his past, he let his actions speak instead of his biography. He made sure the Invisible Initiative had independent funding streams and a board with survivor representation. He sat on no plaques. He found satisfaction in small things. A call from a woman who had used the hotline and kept her job. An email from a lawmaker who wanted to expand protections statewide. A message from Daniel on a Tuesday. A simple line, "Got hired." Thanks. Emma, years removed from the white-knuckled hiding of an arm beneath a desk, had scars that sometimes throbbed in cold weather. She carried those scars like someone who had learned to read the map of her own life. They did not define her. They were coordinates. On a gray morning not unlike the one when Marcus first noticed her, she walked into Sentinel Tower not as the small, folded woman who had once wanted to be invisible, but as a person who understood the anatomy of systems and how to change them. She smiled at the new receptionist and left a small sticky note with a helpline number on the desk. That tiny Acno press, no ceremonial, was exactly the work the Invisible Initiative had been built to do, to make the invisible visible and to give the visible ways to be safe. The receptionist's injury had been unmasked. It began as a small, hidden bruise covered by a sleeve and a plea to remain unseen. It ended as evidence, testimony, systemic consequences, and a movement that refused to let silence be the currency of power. The heartbreaking truth was not merely that one woman had been harmed, it was that institutions had allowed fear to be traded for quiet. The hopeful truth that followed was that when people noticed and chose law over spectacle, the hurt could be held until it stopped shaping lives. If this story matters to you, consider checking the description for trusted resources and ways to support organizations that help workers in precarious positions.